it's multiple double bonds, which those double bonds can be oxidized when they're exposed to heat and some other things. And so the idea is, well, when you cook with these things, and they may get oxidized, and that's going to cause inflammation in your body. So that's a plausible mechanism. So as always, I defer to the human randomized control trials. And so what you tend to find is when you substitute polyunsaturated fats, when you substitute saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats, it's either neutral or positive in terms of the effects on inflammation is basically neutral. There's some studies that show a positive effect of doing polyunsaturated fats, but it probably depends on the individual polyunsaturated fat. And that's the other thing I don't really is difficult, because you're categorizing like everything in this one bucket, and there are some differences between individual fatty acids. Even with saturated fat, for example, stearic acid doesn't tend to raise LDL cholesterol, whereas, saturated fat as a whole tends to raise LDL cholesterol, but there are some saturated fats that don't. So again, it's like we're putting things in buckets, and it's a little more nuanced than that. Then if you look at the effects of polyunsaturated fats on markers of cardiovascular disease, again, tends to either be a neutral or positive effect when you substitute saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. Now, if you want to get into monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated, there's quite a bit of disagreement between the studies. What I would say, based on the human randomized control trials, is that you're probably better off consuming monounsaturated and polyunsaturated in place of saturated fat. But again, if the idea is, well, that means polyunsaturated are good for me, so I'm just going to dump a bunch of oil on everything, and now you're upping your calories. Well, that's a negative now, right? Because you have to deal with the bigger problem of overall energy toxicity. So I'm not somebody who likes to demonize individual nutrients. I just haven't seen really compelling evidence that seed oils are the root cause of the problems that are being suggested. And I think this is a good example of kind of whenever there's something that pops up in the fitness industry, there's always the opposite thing that pops up, and it's the reactionary, extreme reaction to whatever this thing was over here. And I think that's what we're seeing with some of the seed oil stuff. Is it's mostly people who are trying to kind of expose the virtues of saturated fat. And listen, I think it's fine to consume some saturated fat, but again, I think limiting it to 7 to 10% of your daily calorie intake is probably wise. Again, based on all the consensus of the evidence I've seen. And so once again, we're struggling with this. Okay, we've got this epidemiology and these mechanisms that sound good, but then what actually happens when we do some human randomized control trials? And so far, I just haven't seen the evidence to suggest that seed oils are independently bad for you, independent of the calories they contain.
You said the words overall energy toxicity, and I just want to highlight that I think that's a fabulous term. I don't think enough people think about that, because they are primed, or we are all primed to think, okay, seed oils might be bad, or artificial sweeteners might be bad, or this particular component of blood work might represent something good or bad, without taking into account overall energy toxicity, of the toxicity of over-consuming calories, energy. And thank you for pointing out that most of the data point to the fact that saturated fat should make up about no more than 7 to 10% of total daily caloric intake. Is there a lower end threshold that can be problematic? For instance, I've noticed that my blood profiles, especially in terms of hormones, improve when I'm getting sufficient saturated fat. Maybe I'm a mutant, but years ago, because I'm a product of growing up in the 90s, I tried a low-fat diet. It certainly crushed my androgen levels. I started adding some butter back in, and I was right back in the sweet zone where I wanted to be. So 7 to 10% of totally daily caloric intake I'm guessing is probably about what I do now. I'll have to check. But is there a danger to going too low in saturated fats?
So again, no solutions, only trade-offs, right? What maximizes out testosterone might not be the best thing for longevity, right? And vice versa. Now, I'm not making that claim specifically, but I think it's important to understand this, that I think we all have this idea that there's this one iconic diet out there that is going to be the best diet for building muscle and burning fat and preventing cancer and heart disease. And the reality is, like, there's overall healthy dietary patterns that we see that are good for those things. But when we get down into the weeds, there's probably some push and pull here as well, right? So when it comes to saturated fat, there is some evidence that if you're too low on it, that yes, you can have a reduction in testosterone. Now, is that reduction in testosterone, let's say 15, 20%, whatever it may be, is that sufficient to actually cause loss of lean mass? That we don't know. That's never been shown. Interestingly, I just remembered this. There was one study that was comparing polyunsaturated fat versus saturated fat, and they equated total fat. And one of the really interesting things was the group getting the polyunsaturated fat had more lean mass at the end of the study compared to the group getting saturated fat. Now, it's only one study. I've never seen this replicated. So this is a situation where I say, I would like to find out what the mechanism of that is, because this could just be random. But if that gets shown over and over, what I might say is, okay, well, if polyunsaturated are somehow increasing lean mass compared to saturated fat, who cares what happens with testosterone, unless that reduction in testosterone is causing some kind of impotence for your life, right? So all that to say, I don't really know. And by the way, that's something for those watching and listening, real experts, every once in a while, you should hear them say the following words: I don't know.
Exactly. My graduate advisor was exceptional at that, and she was brilliant, right?
Yeah. And then in terms of like cholesterol synthesis, you really need a very, very small amount of saturated fat for LDL cholesterol synthesis. Your liver can synthesize, like, the amount of LDL cholesterol or cholesterol that your body requires is so small in terms of like just living and being healthy. So I don't think you need to worry about that. And from a cardiovascular disease standpoint, there is some evidence that even taking people who have like quote unquote low LDL of like, 80 or 90 and taking them down to like 30 or 40, that there is still a benefit for the risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, you're weighing these two buckets, right? So what I say, if you're doing 7 to 10% from saturated fat, you're probably fine.
Received a lot of questions about whether or not there are female specific diet and exercise protocols. And I realize this is a vast landscape, but some of those questions related to menopause and premenopause, and some related to the menstrual cycle, most related to variations across the menstrual cycle. In terms of, let's just say diet, maintenance or subcaloric diet, are there any things that you've observed? We'll talk a little bit later about this wonderful app that you've produced, this Carbon app, which helps people manage their energy intake and a number of other things. And so there you have a sort of a database, or at least an experience base. And then I'm guessing there are probably also studies exploring male versus female differences in terms of adherence and what sorts of diets work. Are there any general themes that one can extract from that?
This is going to be a really unpopular segment for the women. Doesn't seem to make a big difference.
Well, actually, they may be relieved to hear that, because it would make sorting through the information space, and certainly the information we've covered in this podcast up until now, simpler. It means that everything isn't different for them. Yeah.
So if you look at the male versus female studies in relation to diet, they seem to respond to some similar way. Like similar calorie deficit seems to produce similar results. If you do low carb, high carb, regardless, it seems to boil down to the same principles. Now, training wise, we do know that the muscle fibers adapt a little bit differently to training, but without getting too far into the weeds, it doesn't really change the way you should train. Because for the most part, building muscle, there's a lot of different ways to build muscle. So we know that like light loads up to maybe like 30 reps, as long as it's taken close to failure, have basically the same effect on building muscle, at least in the short term, as heavy loads for low reps. it's mostly about taking the muscle close to fatigue or failure, right? You don't have to go to failure, but getting close within a few reps. If you're between 1 rep and 30 reps, if you're getting close to failure, seem to produce similar results. So again, great. You can pick with whichever form of discomfort you prefer, right? When it comes to female-specific training, again, females actually, this is one thing that a lot of people don't know. They actually put on a similar amount of lean mass as a percentage of their starting lean mass as men. In fact, there's no statistically significant difference in the amount of lean mass they put on. Now, the absolute amount of lean mass that's added will be greater for men because they started with a greater amount of lean mass. But the relative increase in lean mass is pretty much the same from similar training. Now, females, there's some differences in like fiber types. Females tend to be a little bit less fatigable than men. They can go a little bit harder, a little bit longer. And there's also some evidence that they recover a little bit better. But that also could be simply due to the fact that they're not able to use as heavy of loads to induce hypertrophy. So I kind of have this theory that while, as a percentage of your 1 rep max, you can program things, I think absolute load matters. When you look at like the most elite power lifters, the super heavyweights aren't squatting 3 or 4 times a week because, they're squatting 800-900 pounds.
They need more recovery.
I think that there's an overall recovery effect there. Again, I have no data to back this up. This is just my observation. But when you get into the lighter weight classes, and this goes for men too, you do see quite a few people who do, many training sessions at high RPEs and seem to be able to recover from that. So I do think the absolute load makes a difference. Now, when it comes to like menstrual cycle, this is one of those things where I kind of tell people, do what you prefer. So there's some people who have said you should like kind of schedule your training around your menstrual cycle, which is whenever you're going through your menstrual cycle, reduce the intensity, reduce the volume because you're not going to feel as good. You're not going to train as well. What I would say is just auto-regulate that. If you go in and you're on your period, but you feel good and you're doing well that day, then I don't think you necessarily need to back it off. And there was one study that kind of supported that notion. But if you go in and you feel terrible and, you feel like you could use, a reduction in intensity and volume, then it's totally fine to auto-regulate that. And when I say auto-regulation, auto-regulation means you are regulating the individual training session based on your performance. So I auto-regulate insofar as I'm a super nerd, so I have a velocity device, so I can actually attach it to the bar and see how fast the load moves. And I know at various different like warm-up weights what velocities I should be hitting. So if I hit my last warm-up and my velocity is about 10% higher than usual, I can be pretty confident that that's going to be a good day for me. If it's lower, then I can back it off a little bit. In fact, at Worlds, when I hit my last deadlift, it was 30%. My last deadlift warm-up, it was 30% faster than I usually hit in the gym. And I turned and looked at my coach and I said, yeah, we're going to get this today. Right. No, there's various forms of ways to auto-regulate. But again, women, if you're on your period, but you feel good, I don't think there's any reason you need to back off. But if you're not feeling good, then it's totally appropriate to back off.
Raw versus cooked foods. People wanted to know whether or not, for instance, eating a raw apple versus, I don't know, does anyone cook apples? I guess you could, people used to bake, there were baked apples was a dessert when I was a kid. It was kind of the letdown dessert. Sorry, Mom. That was kind of like not awesome unless it had a scoop of ice cream in it. And even pie. Then, maybe not awesome. But anyway, raw versus cooked. Obviously, if you burn a piece of meat to the point where it's pure charcoal, that's too much. And if you eat, there is a small movement surrounding eating raw meats. That's not something I particularly enjoy. Frankly, sushi is the only raw food I personally ingest, and I am very careful about the sourcing. Frankly, reputable places. Is there anything real about this in terms of being able to extract the amino acids, vitamins, and minerals from the food, raw versus cooked?
It just looks cool for Instagram. So when you cook foods, they actually tend to become, in terms of protein-containing foods, they tend to become more digestible, not less. Eggs are this way, meats are this way. People say, well, when you heat protein, you denature it. And I think they hear that word denature and they think destroy. And that is not what denature means. So proteins fold up into 3D dimensional structures, you know this of course, based on their amino acid sequence and their specific energies of those amino acids. When you heat protein or add acid, it starts to unfold that protein structure. That happens during digestion anyway. So I always chuckle when like I've seen some companies come out with whey that you can cook with, right? That's not going to, destroy the amino acids. I'm like, so you mean like regular whey, right? So, typically cooking actually makes amino acids more bioavailable, not less. Now, I would stay away from charring your meat, because there is some evidence that charring creates polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which, at least in animals, when they give those, they appear to be carcinogenic. So if you do char your meat by accident, I would just cut off the charred portions, and then you should be fine.
The char is delicious. Not if it's charred too much, but there is something about a charred crust on a meat. My dad's Argentine, and I would like a good charred barbecue. Yeah. What about people referred to them in their questions as carb blockers, but I think what they're referring to are things like berberine and some of the glucose scavengers. And one glucose scavenger I'd love for you to comment on is this assertion that taking a brisk walk after a meal, or maybe even a slow walk after a meal, some movement can help downshift the amount of circulating glucose in some way. I've heard that. Not a lot of people, but some are starting to pay attention to this idea of taking things like berberine or even metformin can scavenge glucose. I personally can't take berberine. If I take it, I get massive headaches unless I've ingested tons of sugar and carbohydrates. So I just don't mess around with it. But I know there are a number of people out there that want to know whether or not these glucose scavengers can be useful.
I think that is really majoring in the minors, if I'm being honest. As far as like the carb blockers, there's like some white kidney bean extract and those sorts of things. They do block the digestion of carbohydrates, some. So when I say block, that's those watching or listening. Metabolism is typically not on and off switches. Okay, so when we say things like block or attenuate or inhibit, typically we're not talking about just a switch on the wall that you press it and everything turns off. We're talking about a dimmer switch. Okay, it just changes the emphasis. But these carb blockers can reduce the absorption of carbohydrate. Now, they don't seem to cause weight loss when you just do it a normal diet. Now, why is that? Well, all it does is once those carbohydrates get to the large intestine and your bacteria get a hold of them, they start fermenting them to volatile fatty acids, which get reabsorbed into your liver. So you don't get the increase in blood glucose, but you still get almost all the calories from it because it's just in a different form. I see. So, if carb blockers, if they actually worked really well, I mean, if you block something from being absorbed, your GI typically does not just let undigested material sit in there. You get diarrhea. Right. I mean, that would be the outcome. It's also how I debunk the whole 30 grams of protein at a meal. You can't absorb any more than that. I'm like, if that was the case, when you ate a steak, you would just start having diarrhea every time you went over that 30 gram threshold, right?
I remember during college, so this would be early 90s, there was the Olestra craze. Oh, yeah. This idea of putting a non-digestible thing into things like potato chips so that it would clear through the GI tract faster, not absorb as many calories. It does raise, this went nowhere, obviously. You don't hear about this anymore, but it does raise an interesting question related to energy balance, which is gastric emptying time. Mm-hmm. And obviously in the landscape of eating disorders, in particular anorexia, use and abuse of laxatives is a way in which people will, in an unhealthy way, try and control their weight. And there's a lot of problems with that approach. But what about gastric emptying time? Is this one way that people could control their energy balance in a healthy way? And where does fiber come into play?
Fiber tends to improve GI transit time because it adds bulk. So, your GI system is basically a tube, and it has peristalsis, which is wave-like contractions that moves the food down through the tube. Well, if you have more bulk to the food, like with fiber, you can move it through a little bit better. Now, in the gastric, the stomach specifically, fiber tends to delay gastric emptying and slow it a bit, probably because it congeals a little bit. Now, this kind of gets into like the glycemic index argument, right? Like if you do like low GI foods, you'll have a slower release of glucose. It's a slower gastric emptying time. Does that affect energy balance? And so there are quite a few studies looking at like low GI versus high GI foods. In the studies where they don't control calories, low GI tends to outperform high GI, but when they control calories, there's no difference. And so what I think that suggests is low GI foods, just by their nature, tend to be higher in fiber. And so I think it just kind of comes back to the fiber issue.
Got it. I'd like to ask you about supplements for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's an enormous landscape, but I believe there are a few things that you believe in, meaning they exist.
Sure.
and there are decent data to support their use, maybe even some anecdotal data based on your own experience. As long as we highlight it as such, it could be interesting. I've heard you talk about two in particular, one that I'm very familiar with, which is creatine monohydrate. If you could share your thoughts on that, not just for muscle building, but maybe any other purposes for it. And then the other one is one that, frankly, I'm learning more about all the time now, thanks to your prompt, which is Rhodolia rosea.
Mm-hmm.
I think I pronounced that correctly. And why that might be interesting or of use to people.
Yeah. So touching on creatine, it is the most tested, safe, and effective sports supplement we have. I mean, there are thousands of studies on creatine monohydrate now. And I would say very clearly too, if you're using any other form of creatine, I think you're wasting your money. Creatine hydrochloride has some hype around it. It's apparently it's a little more soluble. The claim is that you need less, but there's only a couple studies on it, and it's more expensive.
And
So
creatine monohydrate is not particularly expensive.
No,
right? I
well,
realize people have different budgets, but it's not. It doesn't land in the. It's not a budget breaker.
Yeah, it's gotten more expensive because of COVID and supply chain issues. Even there's forms of creatine that appear to be as good, like hydrochloride, but it's more expensive. And then things like creatine ethyl ester has been shown to be worse than creatine monohydrate. Buffered creatine is as good or worse, and it's much more expensive. So I tell people, just take creatine monohydrate. It is tried and true. It's been shown to saturate the muscle cells 100% with phosphocreatine, and that's what you want. So creatine works through a few different methodologies. One, through increasing phosphocreatine content, which helps improve exercise performance. It also appears to improve recovery, and it increases lean mass, a lot of which is through bringing water into the muscle cells. But muscle cells are mostly water. So when people say, well, it's just water, that's what muscle cells mostly are. And it also increases strength and some other metrics. Now, it also has been shown in studies that people tend to get a decrease in body fat percentage. Now, that's probably because they're getting an increase in lean mass, and so the relative is a decrease in body fat percentage. But there are a few studies that show a decrease in fat mass as well. I don't think that creatine's a fat burner. I think that people are able to train harder, build more lean tissue, and so that's probably having an effect on fat mass. Then they've actually shown more recently some cognitive benefits to creatine, which I find really interesting as well. But the only knock on creatine that anybody's been able to come up with, because they've debunked the kidney stuff, they've debunked the liver stuff, there's no evidence that it harms healthy kidney or liver, is hair loss. So what about hair loss? Because there was one study in 2009 that showed that creatine increased DHT. But they didn't really show an effect on any other sex hormone. So it's kind of strange. Like you would think if there was an increase in DHT, there would be like something else that changes as well. And it's only one study, and again, didn't directly measure hair loss, measured DHT, which we know is involved in the loss of the follicle. So what I would say is that I am not convinced. It's only one study, never been replicated to my knowledge, and it was looking at a mechanism rather than an outcome. So if you're somebody who's prone to hair loss and you want to avoid creatine because of that, I understand. But for most people, I don't think it's something to worry about.
Do you emphasize the classic loading of creatine, taking it a bunch of times per day and then backing off, or just taking it consistently at I think 5 grams per day is kind of the typical dose that people take?
So again, no solutions, only trade-offs. You can load it and you will saturate your phosphocreatine stores faster, like usually within a week. If you just take 5 grams per day, it'll take 2, 3, 4 weeks. But you will get to the same place, and you're probably going to have a much lower risk of GI issues. Some people, creatine can be a gut irritant. If it is for some folks, I would recommend splitting it into multiple doses. So maybe like multiple 1 or 2 gram doses per day. And definitely don't load it if you're somebody who has GI issues from it. As far as rhodiola rosea, the research is still in its infancy. I was just reading a new systematic review that kind of concluded that we need more high quality research, but the research that is out there seems to suggest that not only does it reduce physical fatigue, but it also reduces the perception of fatigue and may also enhance memory and cognition as well. And it's referred to as an adaptogen. So I really like it. My anecdotal experience is when I combine that with caffeine, it tends to kind of smooth out the effects of caffeine. It's a more pleasant experience. And there's also some evidence that if you're like coming off caffeine, that it can reduce the negative side effects to caffeine withdrawal, which, by the way, I didn't really believe in that until I actually did a cold turkey. So before a meet, I will cut out caffeine for 7 days because you can basically reset your caffeine tolerance in 7 days. And like 2 days in, I mean, I'm groggy. I've got the headaches. Usually I'll get like body aches that come up because caffeine is actually a mild analgesic. And yeah, so it was very interesting to see, but I slept like a baby. I'll tell you that.
And then you took caffeine prior to your event.
To the meet. Yeah.
So you really want the maximum punch from it. Yeah. That's why you do that.
Yeah. And like I said, rhodiola it doesn't eliminate those negative effects, but it tends to dampen them a little bit. So I really like it. Again, would like to see more research on it, but there's a lot more stuff coming out. Like ashwagandha is another thing that looks pretty promising. Seems to increase testosterone modestly.
Interesting.
I don't think it's like they've shown increases in lean mass. I don't think the increase in testosterone explains the increase in lean mass. It's just not a big enough increase.
Could it be the decrease in cortisol? People have talked about.
It's possible. It does decrease stress hormones. It also has been shown to help with sleep. But I would like to see more research looking at mechanistically how it's increasing lean mass before I kind of say conclusively that this is the next creatine. There's more research that needs to come out. And then there's some other things that have an effect. Citrulline malate. There was a new meta-analysis that showed that citrulline malate can reduce fatigue and increase, I think, time to fatigue. And it may actually have some small recovery benefits as well. Different forms of carnitine can actually have recovery benefits. And actually interesting, I think it's carnitine tartrate actually has been shown. Volek published a study that actually showed that it increased androgen receptor density in muscle cells.
That's interesting.
Now,
L-carnitine and its other forms are I think there's good evidence that they can improve sperm and egg health for people who are looking to conceive.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there are surprising number of studies on this in humans. But yeah, androgen receptor density, and that's from oral L-carnitine. People are taking capsules, not injecting directly into a muscle. Yeah.
And then you've got things like, obviously, like the other most effective supplement out there is probably caffeine. I mean, like if you look at the research studies, caffeine produces very consistently improvements in performance. So that's another one. Some people don't like the effect of caffeine. That's okay, but
I wouldn't know because I've never come off it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, interestingly, they do show that the effect appears to be consistent. That even if you're a habitual caffeine user, you do still get a benefit every time you take it. But like you said, you're just used to it. So there's those things. Then you've got like things like beta alanine, which it's in our pre-workout, probably not super helpful for most people for resistance training. It does seem to have some benefits for like high intensity. Like if you get out, more than like 45 seconds or 60 seconds of like really hard training, it does appear to help with delaying fatigue for that. And then you've got things like betaine, or also called trimethylglycine, which there's some evidence it can improve lean mass. There's some evidence that it can improve power output. So there's a few things out there, but most of the stuff is not very good. So, I think that's, those kinds of supplements, very useful. But again, I would never tell people they need supplements. Like, again, even like something like creatine is going to be a very small effect compared to like proper nutrition, recovery, and hard training. One of the things I was talking with Ben Bruno the other day, and I said, like some people will ask me like, how does this person make progress? Because, their programming is, it's not evidence-based, or this guy, how's he, like his exercises are dumb. And I'll say, yeah, but they train really hard for 20 years. Like, one commonality you see between like really successful athletes or bodybuilders is they train really hard. And one of the things I have observed is the more into the weeds people tend to get, and again, this is just my own anecdote and observation, the more into the weeds they tend to get, the less hard I see them train. And so one of the things I really like that Mike Israetel said, who's got a PhD and is a bodybuilder himself, he said, you can't out-science hard training. Mm-hmm. That if you're looking to build muscle and you're looking to improve your body composition, the main thing is just doing the work over time.
Consistency and the hard work. And I would add to that, and this is true of academic endeavors too, of course, I hope you'll agree.
Absolutely.
Which is that, the other thing is, given the mental side, earlier we were talking about how satiety signals in the brain and what you think about foods can be relevant. Learning to really enjoy training hard, in addition to learning to really enjoy eating well, not just for the effects that it has on body composition, those two, of course, but just learning to really enjoy the process of training hard and a really hard workout, or a really hard paper that you have to sort through, or really digging through a book that's challenging. Learning to really enjoy that, I think, is if there is a power tool out there, it's the psychological end.
And I think a lot of that is getting the confidence of doing something hard, that there's a payoff at the end, and a lot of people, I get asked a lot in my Q&As, how do I get more confident? How do I become more confident? And I'll tell people, you have to do. There's no hack. You can't read about it. You got to get in the arena. And I don't mean like compete in sports necessarily, but like doing a PhD or doing something, just something hard where you're putting yourself out there and you're saying, this is my goal and I'm going to go for it. You just learn so much by doing that about yourself. And so just what you said, I will reframe things in my mind when bad things happen it's not to say I never get stressed out, because I do. And it's not to say that I never get down, because I do, because I'm a human. But when something bad happens, I actually posted about this in my story today. When something bad happens, I very rarely anymore do I go, woe is me, why did this happen to me? Because you're in the universe, random bad things are going to happen. So instead I say, if I'm not dead, instead I say, well, what an exciting opportunity to overcome an obstacle. And I bet, because in the experience of my life, the biggest lessons and the best things in my life have actually come out of the most challenging, worst things that have happened. And so again, I would never have been able to do these sorts of things if I hadn't taken up weightlifting, because weightlifting taught me so much about perseverance, delayed gratification, overcoming obstacles. And that's why I love it even to this day. And I'll still get butterflies when I go in for a squat session, even though I've been doing it for 23 years.
That's wonderful. Well, it's clear that you embrace hard things. And for people listening to this, obviously it doesn't have to be weightlifting, picking hard things, learning an instrument, learning a language. Challenge is an absolute builder.
And they've actually shown like those sorts of things, like when you challenge yourself and also mentally, that I think there was a new study that came out basically showing a reduction in the risk of Alzheimer's and other age-related cognitive decline. I mean, basically like use it or lose it, right?
Yeah. The will, the desire and the will to persevere, no doubt translates to this thing that we call the will to live, right? It's related to the will to live. Well, I think that what you just said, beautifully embodies what most people are aspiring to, which is I think most people actually want to do hard things. They don't just want to have the results. I think that most people deep down have some understanding that their reward system works that way. I must say, this conversation for me has been tremendously rewarding. First of all, it allowed me to meet you in person for the first time, which I've really enjoyed. I'm certain this won't be our last interaction on this podcast and elsewhere. Also, the amount of knowledge that you contain inside you is astonishing. And
there's a lot of stuff rattling around up there.
Well, and we all benefit because your ability to pull from the mechanistic side, again, I think in not limited to, but related to your background in biochemistry, all the way through to the impact in humans, animal studies, being able to understand where those sit relative to one another. And then you're obviously a practitioner of, you practice what you preach, and what you talk about pertains to men, to women, younger people, older people, people who are vegan, keto, carnivore. You really are able to net a tremendous number of ideas while staying really nuanced and data-driven. And so I just want to say, for myself and on behalf of the listeners, really appreciate you coming in here today and sharing with us your knowledge. We will absolutely point people in the direction of where they can learn more about you. And one of the places that I definitely want to mention before we part, however, is this Carbon app. And I should just mention, this isn't a paid promotion or anything of that sort. Actually, one of our podcast team members has been using Carbon for a long time. This is an app that you devised, which allows people to navigate the exercise, nutrition, energy balance space for weight loss, muscle gain, fat loss, weight maintenance. I would just like to briefly ask you about that before we conclude. Without necessarily telling us everything that's in the Carbon app, I'd love to know what are the major things that it does and is good for? And then what were some of the key things that you wanted to make sure were in there when you built it? Like what's the sort of logical backbone behind it? Because I think there are a lot of food counting, calorie counting, exercise apps out there. Everyone I've talked to that uses Carbon, including our mutual friend Cigar and Getty, this member of my podcast, et cetera, raves about it. So what is Carbon and what does it do? And what was your mindset in building it? What did you really want to see there that you didn't see elsewhere?
So those listening may not know, but I started online coaching people for nutrition back in 2005. And that was the vast majority of my business all the way up until like 2017. And I had a lot of success with that, whether it be just average folks looking to lose weight or build muscle, and right up to elite level competitors in physique sport. So I kind of had this idea, I don't want to say I had the idea. A few people had the idea. What if we could take what I do in coaching and try to automate as much of that as possible? Because, by the time I was becoming a really popular coach, I was expensive. You were looking at me charging. I got to the point where I was charging about $1,000 a month for coaching, right? And most people cannot afford that. And I would like to not just coach rich people. You know what I mean? I would like to be able to help other people. So the idea was to create an app that could do some of this stuff. Now, there's always a place for human interaction, but for people who can't afford that, our app is basically $10 a month. And basically what we wanted to do was set up an app where, think about if you went to a nutrition coach, what would they do? They would probably ask you some questions about your goals, take some anthropometrics, and then they would use that information, maybe dietary preference, and they'd use that information to kind of formulate a baseline plan. That's what Carbon does. So we ask you, I think there's 8 questions in the sign-up flow about your activity, your exercise, your lifestyle, your body weight, your body fat percentage. And if you don't know it, we help you calculate it. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And then your dietary preferences. And we use that to come up with kind of your baseline. And your baseline will be, your calories, your protein, your carbohydrates, and fats. And what's different about our app, because apps like MyFitnessPal or whatever will do that as well. What's different about ours is we encourage people to log their weight daily for the reasons that we talked about earlier. And then you can also track your food in the app. And honestly, I think our food tracker is actually way easier to use than most of them out there. What we typically get great rave reviews about is how user-friendly our interface is, that it makes intuitive sense. And so you track your food, try to hit these macros that you're prescribed, and each week you will be prompted to check in with the coach on your check-in day. And then you put in some information, and then based on how you're progressing, the app will adjust or not adjust based on how you're progressing. So, for example, if you're hitting a weight loss plateau, it will sense that and it will, reduce your calories, or if you're trying to gain weight and you're, hit a plateau, it'll increase your calories. And there's a lot of, back end algorithm stuff that takes care of this. But the fundamental crux of the app is we try to determine your total daily energy expenditure, because that's going to tell us the first big thing we need to know, which is how many calories do you need to be eating for your goal, right? So on the front end, we basically do our best guess based on your anthropometrics. Not going to be perfect, but it'll get us in the ballpark. And if you do know, like some people already know, well, I know what I maintain my body weight on. There's actually a spot where you can manually enter that during the sign-up flow. So that's helpful for people who are super nerds like me. But then if you're just, people will ask, well, do you take Apple Watch data? Do you take this? Do you take that? And no, for the reasons we talked about, that it overestimates energy expenditure. What our app does is it's an algebra equation. Because your body weight, your maintenance calories is your total daily energy expenditure. Your average calories that you eat to maintain your body weight will be the same as your total daily energy expenditure. So if we know how body weight is changing and we know how many calories the person's consuming, we can actually solve for what energy expenditure is, right? And you can see in the app that there's a kind of a maintenance calorie tracker or energy expenditure tracker. And typically after about 3 to 4 weeks, even if the app was off at first, it will have you pretty darn close. Because, like, let's say somebody comes on and their goal is to lose, 1.5 pounds a week or something like that. And the first week they lose 3 pounds. Now, the app actually accounts for the fact that you can lose more water weight the first week, so they probably wouldn't get an adjustment. But let's say the next week they lose 3 pounds. The app will sense that and adjust their calories up, because it will be estimating that their energy expenditures are actually higher than what it had previously estimated based on the amount of weight they're losing. And the same thing goes in reverse. If they're not losing the amount of weight that they're supposed to, it will lower them based on the fact that it may have overestimated their energy expenditure. But that's the first crux of it, is tracking that energy expenditure. And then the next thing is protein. So when the back end algorithm stuff is happening, calories are set first based on your energy expenditure and your goal. So for example, if you're on an aggressive diet, your calories are going to be lower, even if your energy expenditure might be a little bit high. Just because if you're trying to lose 2 pounds a week, you're going to be in a pretty aggressive calorie deficit. So it's going to set the calories first. Then it will set protein based on your lean body mass. Then the calories that are left over will be allotted to carbohydrate and fat depending on your dietary preference. And we have a few different dietary preferences. There's balanced, which is about 50-50 to 60-40 carbohydrate to fat of the remaining calories. Then you have low fat, which is obviously a higher ratio of carbohydrate. You have low carb. You have a ketogenic diet, which is very, very low carb. And then there's also a plant-based option. And within each of those options, still, you can go in and actually shimmy the macros a little bit within a certain range so that you can kind of dial in what your specific dietary preference is. Because again, if we go back to what is going to produce the best long-term results, it's whatever the person can adhere to. So we really try to start with the concept of adherence by allowing people to have the dietary preference that they want. And there's some other apps out there that are good apps. Like, for example, we get asked a lot, what's the difference between our app and the Renaissance periodization app? And they have a great app. But theirs is kind of more rigid, and it'll say, you're going to eat this many meals and you're going to have these foods at these times. So we're kind of the opposite. We want to give you maximum flexibility. Now, for some people, they would prefer the rigid structure at first. But we find that for most people, giving them more flexibility typically improves adherence over the long run. So that's kind of how the app works. And again, like, there's multiple different goals. It's not just a weight loss app. There's a maintenance, there's a muscle building. So you've got all kinds of different goals that can be accommodated, different rates of each of those goals. And I've used the app for over 3 years now to do my body weight. And like, when I say that it's dialed me in, because I'm very regimented with, logging and logging my weight. So what I targeted to weigh in at Worlds, I got down to the 0.1 kilogram. So
fantastic.
it's pretty cool to be able to like use a tool that I helped develop to actually coach me. So it's a great tool. We did some statistics. We polled 2,500 members, and one of the questions we asked is, would you recommend this to a friend? And 91% said yes. So we our average, I think our average retention is like 7 months, which for an app that costs $10 a month is really great.
That's
so
great. Yeah, as I mentioned, a number of people I know use it. This is not a paid promotion. But I think people need guidance and tools. And what we know about the human brain is that winging it can work, but that the brain will cheat itself often. There's a Feynman quote about this, and I'll get it wrong, and always bad to try and quote Feynman anyway, because he said it so much better. But that we are the easiest, it's easy to fool ourselves, basically, is what he was saying. Easiest to fool ourselves.
Absolutely.
Sounds great. We will put a link to it so that people can check it out. Again, it sounds like a wonderful tool, and a tool that nets a lot of the principles that sit as major themes for weight loss, weight gain. I would assume directed lean tissue gain is what most people are after, and weight maintenance, because a number of people would like to just maintain. Listen, I really appreciate your time and all that you're doing. Certainly your time and energy and knowledge today, but also what you're doing on the various social media channels, and just the fact that somebody from the depths of academia is out there sharing so much knowledge across so many domains. You're a gem in this landscape of nutrition, and one that people really need to hear from. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
We'll do it again. Thank you for joining me today for my discussion with Dr. Layne Norton. I hope you found it to be as interesting and informative and actionable as I did. If you're learning from and are enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions or suggestions about topics and guests you'd like me to include on the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comments section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. In addition, please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning of today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. During today's episode and on many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discussed supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like sleep, hormone augmentation, and focus. If you'd like to see the supplements discussed on various episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, please go to livemomentous.com/Huberman. We partner with Momentous because they are of extremely high quality, they ship internationally, and they formulated supplements in the precise ways that are discussed as optimal to take for various outcomes here on the Huberman Lab podcast. The Huberman Lab also has a zero-cost newsletter that you can access. It includes summaries of podcast episodes, as well as summaries of various protocols for mental health, physical health, and performance. You can sign up for the newsletter by going to hubermanlab.com, going to the menu, and look for the Neural Network newsletter sign up. You just provide your email, and I assure you we do not share your email with anybody. And again, it's completely zero cost. Again, go to hubermanlab.com and sign up for the Neural Network newsletter. And if you're not already following us on social media, we are Huberman Lab on Instagram, Huberman Lab on Twitter, and Huberman Lab on Facebook. And at all of those sites, I provide science and science-related tools for mental health, physical health, and performance, some of which overlap with information covered on the Huberman Lab podcast, but often which is distinct from information covered on the Huberman Lab podcast. So again, that's Huberman Lab on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion with Dr. Layne Norton. If you are interested in some of the resources that he and I discussed, including his Carbon app, as well as other resources that he provides, please go to the links in the show note captions. And last, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in.
But there's a lot of controversy in this field about whether oxytocin is a treatment for autism, right? So after we completed that trial, there was a large multi-site, what's called a phase 3 oxytocin treatment trial that was done at, I think, 5 sites. And they gave oxytocin for an extended period of time, and they showed no benefit. And
were they looking to see who started off with low levels of oxytocin at pre-treatment?
So what was interesting about that study, and there were a lot of issues with it, was that Oxytocin is something where you have to, if you look at it, it degrades. Is like, that's kind of what I joke about, right? So you need to take it. When we go in, we have like these really intense protocols, right? So you go in and we have vacutainer tubes that are cold and we put them on ice, and then the phlebotomist takes the blood from the child.
So a lot of technical gymnastics.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we make sure we spin it in a centrifuge cold, and then we pipette it onto dry ice. So we have very minimal loss of the signal. And so if you don't adhere to those rigid protocols, which is very difficult to do across multiple sites, it can be very difficult to get an accurate read of oxytocin. And so I think for me, it's still an open question. They didn't see that blood oxytocin predicted response in that study. The data weren't provided in the paper. It was just said that they didn't. But it's still an open question. And so that, maybe that is the way. So if you give it acutely, like in those early studies we talked about, that maybe oxytocin, diminishes fear. We know that oxytocin decreases the stress axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and then it can diminish anxiety in animal models. So that's well established. And in a former life, I was a stress researcher. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. But it's sort of, the sad thing is that once you have a negative trial, there isn't a lot of interest in funding the work going forward, right? And so I think it's still really an open question about if there is a subset of individuals that could benefit from oxytocin replacement therapy, right? And until there's money to do that work, we may not ever know the answer.
Well, it will be important for that work to be done eventually. Hopefully the field will return to it despite whatever trends might be happening now. I think it's important to know for the parents of autistic children whether or not there were any negative effects of oxytocin administration, in particular in the children that did not benefit from oxytocin treatment. The rationale is the following. Well, of course, these things require a prescription. If a parent has a child with autism, especially if they're young enough that the behavioral interventions could possibly stand a good chance of inducing neuroplasticity, rewiring of the neural circuits that underlie social connection, well, then there's this time-limited window in which, those parents presumably are willing to try most anything provided it's safe.
Right.
So let's assume, and I'm making up these numbers now because I haven't seen this study, but according to what you told me, that let's say a third of the autistic boys and girls that come in have low baseline levels of oxytocin. They're the ones that are going to benefit from this oxytocin intervention. The other 2/3 don't. Well, given the difficulties of measuring baseline levels of oxytocin, most people don't have access to those kind of resources. If it's safe to give oxytocin no matter what, well then, if I were that parent, I'd be knocking on my physician's door saying, hey, give me an oxytocin spray because my kid might fall into that 1/3 category. If and only if it turns out that oxytocin is safe to give.
Right.
But if there's a risk profile that doesn't justify that kind of shotgun approach, well, then I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So is oxytocin spray safe? And if so, why doesn't every physician who has a patient with autism give them oxytocin nasal spray?
Right. It's a great question. And I know that, I'm a parent of 3 children, and I know this sense of like, you would do anything to help your child, right? And so I think the tricky part is that, so one thing I will say is that all of the studies, and there's been many of them, have shown that oxytocin is relatively safe in a pediatric population, right? The tricky part is I don't know. There's physicians that, really pay attention to clinical trials. And if they don't see a benefit, they may not be willing to write the prescription, right? So until we could identify a group of children that could benefit, we need to create the opportunity for physicians to recognize that this could potentially still be a treatment, right? But that work, but I think the tricky part, and what I will say is, and we can maybe talk a bit about vasopressin, which, my feeling is that if I was placing bets and having to choose between these two, my money would be on vasopressin.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are definitely going to talk about vasopressin in detail. I mean, the reason I mentioned that hypothetical scenario is just the sense of urgency and in some
course.
cases desperation that parents feel.
Yeah.
And, time's ticking. And if oxytocin's safe, then, I guess I'll put in my vote that, parents should at least talk to their physician, maybe even hand them the study to consider. But I can also understand the perspective of a pediatrician who says, well, listen, it was a small number of kids that benefited. You're welcome to try it. But I don't, it doesn't seem like the results are that impressive. But this gets to a bunch of larger issues about, medical care and randomized controlled trials and the desperation of parents and kids to treat neurodevelopmental challenges.
Right.
I just want to ask, because it feels relevant in a real way, if ultimately the goal of improving symptom profiles in autistic kids is about improving social cognition and social behavior, and that process involves rewiring of brain circuits, neuroplasticity, is there any reason to think that other approaches to inducing neuroplasticity would be beneficial, even if they're not in the biological pathways that are disrupted in autism? I think, for instance, about the now extensive use of SSRIs for the treatment of depression. In some cases it works, in some cases it doesn't. Side effect profiles are a serious concern, as I've discussed on this podcast before. But ultimately, we know that depression is not a serotonin deficiency in most cases. SSRIs or atypical antidepressants like bupropion, Wellbutrin, and things of that sort, when they work, they probably work because of their ability to induce or assist neuroplasticity. Right. Also, the trials on psilocybin are not really about psilocybin. They're about neuroplasticity, at least the trials for depression, right? There may be other uses of psilocybin that relate more directly to the effects of psilocybin. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is the attempt to rewire the brain in a specific way, whether or not it's assisted by oxytocin or some other mechanism. So the question is, are there trials happening where people are exploring, say, psilocybin, MDMA, which, by the way, we know increases oxytocin and serotonin dramatically, as well as things like atypical antidepressants in kids that have autism, not because we think that those autistic kids are deficient in any of the neurochemicals that these drugs would target, but that these drugs can help rewire the brain. And ultimately, that's what these kids need.
Right. It's a really great point. And there might be subsets of kids, right? There might be kids where there would be a medication that would target other pathways, but that potently releases oxytocin, right? But there might be kids that have an oxytocin deficiency, right? But I think that circles back to your point at the beginning, or our point, is that autism is a very heterogeneous condition, and being able to know before you begin a trial, right? Like, who am I going to put into it? And what is my primary outcome? Like, one measure that I think is going to move the needle, right? Like, it kind of requires a crystal ball. So there's a lot of guesswork that goes into this. But I would very much like to see, I will say one other thing that I have a colleague named Adam Guastella, who's at the University of Sydney, and he published a paper a year or two ago now suggesting that oxytocin may be most effective in kids at younger ages. And I don't quote me, somewhere between 2 and 5 or 3 and 6 or something.
We'll find the
like
paper
that.
And put it in the show notes.
But, so it could be, to your point about neuroplasticity, that oxytocin may be maximally beneficial in younger ages, right? And if these studies are these hodgepodges across ages and across sort of different social phenotypes, finding that signal is really important, right? And maybe age is a driver, or maybe, low blood oxytocin regardless of what age you are, or maybe in Adam's case, if you recruit really young children, you're likely to see a benefit just because the brain is wiring up and it's more plastic at, younger ages.
Yeah, that's also a vote, in my opinion, for early examination of kids, right? Like, parents really need to get autism screening, and perhaps maybe the most important thing is to make autism screening as available and as inexpensive as possible for everyone. because of the importance of early intervention, even if it's purely behavioral intervention, but
Right.
certainly if it's behavioral and drug interventions.
But the clinic wait times are really long, right? So you have to have a specialist who's capable to diagnose autism. And so you could have a clinic where, you're showing troublesome features and a parent wants to get their kid into a clinic, and you could have a 12-month or 18-month wait time, right? And so there are a lot of people that are thinking about, are there laboratory-based tests that we can develop, maybe either for detection or clinical referral, right? So could we come up with a biomarker panel, for instance, where we might be able to say, wow, here's a panel where we think this child is at reasonable risk for developing autism. Can we make sure they're prioritized for getting a diagnosis, right? So we can get them an early intervention. But right now we don't have that, right? So having some sort of laboratory-based test, whether it could be biological, or if we could do something with eye gaze. And there's a lot of companies working on these things now to say this may not, and also obviously, again, autism is always controversial in this field, right? There's so many different stakeholders. A lot of clinicians will say, well, I don't want a 30-second video clip replacing expert clinical opinion. And there's good reasons for them to feel that way. But I think if there was a way to prioritize people that are in this line, we could get diagnoses faster.
Well, you wouldn't want false positives, but I would think that a 30-second video clip, provided it's of something useful, is going to be more valuable than nothing, given the time sensitivity. What are some of the barriers to getting this behavioral testing to be not just more prominent, but pervasive? Like, it seems to me that, well, I recall in school, they gave us the hearing test. We all marched onto the bus. We get the beep test, and, for hearing challenges, we get vision tests. You get the Babinski reflex test, not the moment you come out of the womb, but pretty soon after. I mean, why isn't this stuff happening for autism for every kid?
Yeah, it's not scalable, right? So these interviews with parents and the tests that you do can take hours, right? And any given clinician, even if they're working really long hours, there just aren't that many people that have the extensive training needed to make these expert diagnoses, right? And so I think that there's, clinicians that are doing the absolute best they can, but they can only see a certain number of people a week, right? And
does it have to be a physician? Sorry to interrupt. Does it, or could a well-trained technician do this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think technically it's a DSM diagnosis, right? So it's usually somebody who has a clinical degree. So it would be a clinical psychologist. It could be a behavioral pediatrician. It could be, a child psychiatrist or a child neurologist. But I mean, again, that requires years and years of training. And if we look in areas where people have fewer access to resource, I mean, particularly in impoverished areas, the mean age of an autism diagnosis is years later than in wealthy areas where there's many different medical specialists with parents, that aren't working 3 jobs and, can sit waiting around, and really lobby and really advocate for their kids, right? Because, if they don't show up for work that day, they're not going to get fired from their job, right? And so I think that, if there's some sort of solution that allows there to be a more democratic approach to saying we need a really quick way, like you said, to be able to identify at-risk children, especially if it's a blood test or something like that, it could be incredibly impactful.
Are there human trials exploring MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, also referred to as ecstasy, and or psilocybin for treatment of autism?
So I was aware that MAPS had an MDMA trial in autism. I don't know what's happened with that.
Yeah, perhaps it's still ongoing. I'll check the MAPS site. I'm in communication with them from time to time. I mean, the reason for asking it, of course, but maybe in case some of the listeners don't, is that MDMA causes these massive increases in serotonin. That seems to be the major source of the MDMA effect, so to speak, based on the work of our colleague, Rob Malenka, and in at least one human study comparing MDMA to very high-dose oxytocin treatment, kind of ruled out the oxytocin spike that's induced by MDMA as the source or the only source. But of course, these chemicals can synergize. I mean, but based on its chemical profile, oxytocin release, massive serotonin release, dopamine release, and a propensity to enhance neuroplasticity. I mean, assuming all the safety protocols were there, seems like not the perfect drug, but not a bad choice. If, of course, it's inducing the kind of plasticity that someone with autism would be seeking.
Right. I mean, I think the tricky part, especially in children, right, is there's going to be a reluctance to potentially give them psychedelics, right? And so, is there a way to modify, the chemical compound to, be something that parents might be more willing to give to their children, right?
Right. And I totally agree with that. I guess to play devil's advocate, not against you, but well, I'll just state it very directly, and then I'll take the heat as necessary. I mean, I've done 2 episodes about the drugs that, millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of parents are already giving their kids for ADHD, which are include amphetamines, including dioxine. Methamphetamine is actually a prescription drug for a very small subset of kids with ADHD, but things like Adderall, Vyvanse, even methylphenidate, Ritalin. I mean, these are amphetamines. They induce dopamine release and norepinephrine release. And again, I'm not suggesting people give their kids MDMA to try and ameliorate symptoms of autism, but something chemically similar to it ought to be developed or at least explored in a human trial, in my opinion. Well, time will tell. I'll reach out to the MAPS group and see what's happening. Let's talk about vasopressin.
Yes.
Because there's a lot to discuss there. So you told us this is a molecule that chemically is very similar to oxytocin. Is it manufactured in the human brain and body?
Yes.
Okay. Do we know a subset of the sites that it's known to be produced and where some of its actions are? I mean, you mentioned the kidney and the antidiuretic hormone roles, but within the brain, like what brain areas have neurons that make vasopressin?
Well,
or have the receptors for vasopressin?
Yeah, I mean, the receptors are all over the brain. And again, it varies depending on the species. And, the way the receptors are measured are in postmortem tissue, right, which can be very difficult to get good samples, right? And so we need to have that caveat going in. But yeah, I mean, it's made in the hypothalamus, and it's released all over the brain, and there's vasopressin receptors all over the brain, right? And what's really interesting about vasopressin, I always sort of joke that oxytocin, always saw its day in the sun, if you will, and the vasopressin was sort of the stepchild that was like left, sort of behind. And the reason why I find this fascinating is, again, like I think back to my my roots as a, evolutionary biologist, behavioral neuroscientist. And what was interesting is that there were studies in the early to mid 1990s showing that vasopressin was critical for male social behavior. And so there was work, there was a variety of people, and I think Rob Malenka mentioned this on the podcast he did about, there's a group of people like Sue Carter, Larry Young, Tom Insel, some of these early people, and they gave vasopressin to male prairie voles, and vasopressin was what induced pair bonding with a female mate, and also paternal care.
And as I recall, those experiments were done in the context of looking at polygamy versus monogamy of these prairie voles.
Prairie voles versus like a different species, so same genus, but a different species. So it might be a montane vole or, highly related, but these other species. So prairie voles are monogamous. The males.
For life?
Well, I mean, that was the
50% divorce rate.
Yeah, that was not, I don't think it's that bad, but I think
they're doing better than we are as a species.
That's true. Yeah. We should look to them for pointers.
And all the divorce folks are saying, wait, why'd you say better? I have some divorce friends that have said, divorce is like the greatest thing. So we always say like doing better, doing worse, right? Anyway, that's a whole other podcast, and certainly not the Huberman Lab podcast, or maybe it is, or will be. But yeah, my understanding is that you have certain voles that mate with almost exclusively with one other vole for their entire lifespan. And then you have other voles located elsewhere that in those colonies, they mate with lots of different voles. So the males and females have lots of different partners, raise young with lots of different partners, mating with lots of different partners. And that if you give vasopressin, then you can make the I always want to call them polyamorous, but I don't know
yeah.
if they love each other. I'm going to anthropomorphize and assume that they love each other. The polygamous moles, not polyamorous, but polygamous moles then become monogamous.
Well, I would say that is probably not the take-home message. So the take-home message would be they had, let's say that there was like the good voles, right, which are the prairie voles, and they were the ones that form these monogamous pair bonds. Dad participates in paternal care with mom. They co-raise babies together, and then dad chases off intruders, right? And then there's the more asocial voles, and so these are like the montane voles, we'll state it's a complicated story, but there's these montane voles where males and females live separately. Females like maybe live on the male's territory. The male mates with a few different females, absolutely